I would like to introduce you to David Cooke. Now, his journey didn't start off with straight A's. In fact, he barely scraped through his HSC. But that didn't stop him. He started working on production lines in factories before landing the coveted job as a postman. Saving up from that role allowed him to chase his dream, and at 19, he headed overseas to train as a teacher of transcendental meditation. After 8 years of trying to save the world, David realised that goodwill didn't pay the bills, so he ventured into the tech world. Over the next 35 years, he worked his way up in some of the largest global technology companies, moving from sales to management, eventually becoming CEO and chairman. In the later stages of his career, his academic fortunes took a turn for the better, earning him not one, but 2 doctorates. One for his groundbreaking research into corporate social responsibility, and an honorary doctorate for his efforts in promoting sustainability in a corporate world. From humble beginnings to decorated leader in tech and sustainability, David's is a story of resilience, growth, and vision. Please put your hands together for David Cooke.
So, when you first hear the phrase big business, what immediately comes to mind? I imagine it wasn't kindness, compassion, or empathy. Imagine the world, however, if they were the common characteristics of business. And it's that world that I'd like to speak to you about now. As mentioned, my name is Dr. David Cooke. I'm the author of a book called Kind Business, Values Create Value. And I did spend 35 years in the tech world. And it's probably fair to say that during those 35 years, I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly that the business world has to offer. And when I saw poor business decisions being made, I think I could characterize them really as a mindset of short-termism, where the head of that company or the senior people in that organization were fixated with the share price of the company and the next dividend for the shareholders. They had no real vision into the future. Now, that actually has a name. It's called shareholder primacy. But there's another way of doing business as well, and that's called stakeholder primacy. And that is where the leaders of the organizations assess what their positive impact might be on multiple people and multiple aspects of society, and they run their company in that way. Now, a debate has raged for some time around whether a company can in fact be good and make profit at the same time or not. Also, whether a business has any moral or ethical responsibility towards society to have a positive impact beyond simply manufacturing and supplying goods and services and paying wages and taxes. Now, in the last 50 years or so, one of the strongest contributors, if you like, to that discussion was a man called Milton Friedman. He was an award-winning economist. In fact, he'd won the Nobel Prize for economics. And he wrote an article in the early 70s, which was published in the New York Times, in which he said, the one and only one social responsibility of business is to generate profits. Now, that was seized upon by the captains of industry at that time, and for decades into the future. They interpreted that to mean that you had to choose between profit and purpose. You couldn't do both. And certainly probably the most iconic corporate leader in that era, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, seized on that with great vigor. That was a man called Jack Welch. He was the global CEO of General Electric, and he was lauded as the greatest business leader of his time for the stellar financial performance of the organization. And he was put up on pedestals, he wrote books, and he was feted as a great corporate leader. But how did he produce those stellar returns for investors? He did it by absolutely decimating entire townships in the Midwest of the USA. That was the manufacturing belt. He moved manufacturing offshore because it was cheaper. entire townships basically closed down. There were hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs, and it was a devastating impact. Now, it's interesting, we can see that some corporate decisions might lead to a negative impact for society, even if it's good for the shareholders, but might there also be negative consequences for the companies themselves in the longer term when they operate in that way? Now, global consulting firm McKinsey were quite fascinated with answering this question. And they launched a study called the McKinsey Longevity Research. And what they did is they took the Standard & Poor's 500, the S&P 500 in the US, the 500 biggest listed companies in America, and they went back in time and they put a stake in the ground at 1958. They analysed every single company and they had a look at how long they'd been in existence for. And on average, they had existed for 61 years. So on average, they'd been founded in 1897, and there they were thriving in 1958. They then moved the dial up to the year of the research study, 2023, and they had a look at what is the average lifespan of a company in that era, and they were shocked to find it was less than 18 years. In other words, current business practices were causing the demise of the very businesses themselves. So then they extended the study and they extrapolated it out to what might the S&P 500 look like in just 4 years' time, in 2027. And they determined that by 2027, 75% of the companies, the 500 biggest companies in America at that time, will simply no longer exist. In other words, it's as if capitalism is kind of eating itself with this myopic focus on today and the share price today and the CEO's next bonus that year or what have you. So the practice wasn't working. Now, I mentioned to you that I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly of the business world, so let's talk about the good for a moment. And there have been some wonderful leaders out there, and there still are. Probably my favourite, who I'd like to talk about for a moment now, is a man called Paul Polman, and he was the global CEO of Unilever. Now, you may not have heard of Paul Polman, you may not have heard of Unilever, but you've probably enjoyed some of their products. If you've eaten a Magnum ice cream, or a Cornetto, or a Ben & Jerry's, or you've used Lux soap, or Dove soap, or Rexona products, or had Sunlight cleaning products in your home, then they all come from Unilever. It's an Anglo-Dutch, fast-moving consumer goods conglomerate, and it is huge. It's a massive organisation. Now, when Paul Polman was appointed as the global CEO, he did something a little bit radical. He immediately said to the board, who'd just given him the job, and to the stock market community, no more quarterly profit updates. I'm not going to forecast how much profit we're going to make in 3 months' time. I'm not doing that anymore. And the stock market analysts were absolutely up in arms. Well, if you don't give us any guidance, we can't decide whether to put your stock in our portfolios or recommend it to our clients. And of course, what happened is that the Unilever share price just started to plunge. But he explained why he wasn't going to do it anymore. He said, I'm not here for the next 3 months. I'm going to build an amazing company for the future, and it's going to be based on sustainable principles. And he set about putting in place initiatives on all sorts of levels. He really started to care for the people that worked in that organisation. He was famous for ringing people up on their first day, wherever they were in the world, and saying, hi, we haven't met. I'm the CEO of the company, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. All sorts of initiatives like that, very heartfelt. He ran a sustainability agenda where he wanted his organisation to have a very light footprint on the planet. And he also cared about the human rights of everybody, not just inside Unilever, but inside their whole ecosphere, their supply chain that fed into their organisation. So think about it, you know, they sold ice creams and chocolates and things like that. So there were thousands and thousands of tiny farmers, for instance, that would grow cocoa beans, and Unilever would buy them and they'd use them in their products. And he knew there was child labour in those supply chains, and he wanted to root that out. So he started to focus on all these areas of the company. So what happened? The share price started to go up. And during his 10 years of running Unilever, Unilever produced, on average, double the profits of the other people on the FTSE, that is the Financial Times Stock Exchange, so the London Stock Exchange, produced more than double the average profit of all of the other companies put together. So his formula absolutely worked for the people, and it absolutely worked for the investors who were buying shares and risking their money. So he's a leader I really like, and he was very fond of questions, because he thought that questions made you think. And one of his key questions to all the other corporate leaders around the world was, is the world a better place because your company is in it? I think it's a great question. Now, bringing things a little bit closer to home. I was in the tech world for 35 years. The last 8 of those, I was the managing director of a Japanese technology company called Konica Minolta. Again, not the strongest brand, but you'll know Konica Minolta's competitors. They're Xerox, they're HP, they're Canon. So it's in the business imaging sector, if you like. You know, printers and scanners and that type of equipment everybody has in their office. It's B2B, not B2C, so no home printers, but the larger type of printers. Now, the interesting thing about my appointment was that for 40 years that Konica Minolta had been in Australia, it had always been run by a Japanese person. Sent out from Tokyo for 4 years on a visa, they'd go back, another one would be sent out. So we got to the end of one of those cycles, the MD was about to go back. A few people came out from head office to make the announcement. Everybody thought it'll be one of those guys in the front row, it'll be the new guy, everyone's waiting to find out, it's the big annual conference. And the most senior person got up and he said, I'm pleased to announce your new managing director is David Cooke. So I was the first non-Japanese managing director of Konica Minolta Australia and the first non-Japanese person in the Konica Minolta world to report to Tokyo. So it was reasonably groundbreaking within our little industry and our sector, if you like. Now, I walked up on stage and I turned to the audience, there were about 300 people, and I said, I want us all to work together to build a company that cares about the people that work here, that cares about our customers, and that cares about our community. I walked into work the next day for the first time as the managing director. I sat down at my laptop and I wrote to everybody in the company and I said, a lot of you weren't able to attend the conference, but this is the vision statement I made. Now, there's only one problem. I don't actually know how to achieve it, and I need your help. Now, that broke all the management textbook rules because everybody was shocked that I'd been given the job, and I was probably, if you follow conventional thinking, supposed to reassure them that, yes, I'm the right guy. I'm steadying the ship. I know what I'm doing. I've got a plan. I said the opposite. And in a way, what I did was I showed vulnerability and perhaps even some humility when I went to them and said, please help me. We sent out a questionnaire and we got something like a 95% response rate to an anonymous voluntary questionnaire. And we got 800 ideas on stuff we needed to do to make our company a better company, which of course was gold for a new person who's just started the job. I'd never been a managing director before. So in came these ideas. And there's a phrase from Hugh Mackay, who's a very well-known social demographer, which is, every human being's greatest need is to be heard. And I learned that lesson very quickly, so I'm 48 hours in now. And what I really learned was that one of the greatest leadership strengths you can have is the ability to listen, to ask questions, to seek advice, to seek help, and then to listen, and then, of course, to implement the ideas that might make make good sense to people and to the business. And interestingly, some of the executive team, which I inherited, were very nervous about asking people what they wanted. And they said, oh, they're just going to ask for more money and they're going to ask for shorter hours and more flexibility, and don't ask them because you're not going to be able to give it to them, so don't even ask in the first place. I had a little bit more confidence in our people. And interestingly, one of the main things everybody asked for was more purpose in their role. We didn't have things like charity partnerships, which were very common in a lot of companies. They said, we want charity partners. We want to be able to go and volunteer with those charity partners. If there's younger children involved, we'd like to be able to be mentors for those kids, that sort of thing. And so another strategy we put in place was, we said, okay, well, you tell us who the charity should be. And we had everybody vote. It was just a completely democratic process. You can kind of get a sense probably that it's gone from a little bit of a hierarchical Japanese, little bit sterile sort of organization, where the MD was very removed, and even physically with a remote sort of office, he was rarely seen, to a situation where we're just talking. There's this constant dialogue. Oh, you want partners? Charity partners? Oh, who would you like? There's a lot of dialogue going, a lot of engagement going on. And they chose the number of partners. They chose the Smith family, and in a social category, they chose land care for the environment. And we'd go out together and have team building exercises, doing bush regeneration. They chose the Breast Cancer Network of Australia, a Melbourne-based charity. And shortly afterwards, we added a fourth category called humanitarian, and we decided that we would support a Cambodian charity that was rescuing and rehabilitating young women from regional villages who'd been trafficked into the major cities in Cambodia. And that came about because we had a conference in Cambodia and we needed a keynote speaker. And I'd never been to Cambodia before, I didn't know who to get. And somebody recommended a particular woman who'd started this organization and was doing this work. And she brought 5 young women with her who had been rescued. And there's an expression in the human rights world, which is, once you know, you can't unknow. And once you've seen, you can't unsee. Now, these young women were the first slaves I'd ever met, former slaves. And we decided on the spot, we would provide money for kids to go to high school. We would provide university scholarships and laptops and English language lessons for those that were able to qualify for university. And we were able to literally change lives. So I'd like to finish up with sharing one story with you, which was, for me, in many ways, probably one of the most meaningful episodes of my time as a managing director. I invited everybody in the company who had worked there for 25 years or more to come out to dinner with me. They came from all around Australia. There were about 12 people, not a lot. Interestingly, they all came from the one job role at Keynote Minolta. They were all field service engineers. Ever been in an office and the printer or the photocopier or the scanner breaks down and you ring up and somebody runs in the uniform with the brand on it and they fix it? Those guys. It was just a cheap and cheerful restaurant, Manly in Sydney, no private dining room or anything, and we had a lovely evening. After a couple of hours, we're getting ready to go, and one man sitting at the end of the table, I remember, who hadn't spoken all evening, a very quiet man. He said, "Could I please say something before we leave?" I said, "Of course you can. I'd be delighted." And he stood up in this public restaurant. Other diners turned around to see what was happening. And he made what I reckon was probably the first public speech he'd ever made in his life. And this is what he said. He said, "For over 25 years, I've worked in this company. And during that entire time, I never told anybody where I worked. I just didn't see the point. It was just a job that I went to where I did a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. And that's how I fed my family. Now, I tell every single person I meet that I work for Keynote Minolta. I'm back in the room. And he said, why would I do that? He said, I do that because I feel so proud to work for a company that would care about young women on the other side of the world who've been trafficked into a life of sexual slavery. Now it's interesting, that man's engagement scale went from relatively disengaged. It was a good enough company to stay for 25 years, but he was pretty disengaged. And that dial went to fully engaged, and it kept going. He became a public advocate with everybody that he met about how he felt about our organisation. Now, in all of my time in the business world, I've never seen anything as powerful to create a sense of purpose, engagement, belonging, than when a company puts people first and seeks to enhance the well-being of people inside the company and people outside the company. Now, what happened to our business? A little bit like Paul Polman's business. What happened was for 10 years between the global financial crisis and COVID, that business grew every single year against competitors with much more dominant brands. And remember, we're talking about an industry really that relies on hard copy bits of paper popping out of the end of machines. That business globally was dropping, of course, as everything became digital. But while the business globally was dropping for all organisations, ours was climbing. We defied gravity. And we won lots of big contracts with companies who'd never dealt with us before. And I used to always go to them and say, thank you for selecting us as your technology partner. We think you've made a really good decision, but can you please let me know why you think you made a good decision? And typically they'd say something like this, and I'll use one man's response to sum up everybody else's. They're all very similar. And this guy said, well, we used to assess the tender bids that came in based on product, price, and service. But now we go a step further. He actually said we look under the hood. So we don't just look at the bright, shiny car you're trying to sell us. We look under the hood now. And he said, and when we looked under the hood at Konica Minolta, what we saw was an organisation who had values, very deep values that you live by. And we realised that your values and our values aligned. And we realised that you're a really good fit for us. And that's why we've given you the contract. And I suspect you'll have it for many, many years to come. So what the business world taught me was that really business is just about people. It's about the people who work there. It's about the people who invest in the company. It's about the people who buy the goods and services, but it's all about people. And when a company puts people first, the profits will follow. It is unwise to put the profits first. So I guess you can probably tell that I'm a fairly big proponent of the phrase that when a business does good, that business will do well. So thank you for your kind attention.